Welcome. My name is Andreas Tesch and I'm the Chief Market Officer of Atradius, the leading global trade credit insurer. Thank you for joining us for the fourth and final webinar in our series, where we have been exploring some of the most important trade and economic issues currently affecting businesses throughout the world. Today's event focuses on de-globalization and in many ways brings all of the parts of previous webinars together. So are we seeing a trend in de-globalization? And what are businesses doing right now to protect themselves from these inevitable shocks? Reshoring, nearshoring, diversifying. How permanent do we expect these trends to be? I'm pleased to say we have a panel of economic and business experts who can help us explore and answer these very questions. I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Daisy McAnder. Daisy is an experienced journalist, and I'm pleased to say is a seasoned Atradius webinar presenter. I'm delighted to welcome her back today, and I leave you in her hands. Over to you, Daisy.
Andreas, thank you so much. And as you said, this is the fourth and last in this series, and I've been so privileged and honoured to be partaking or chairing the other three. And we're going to introduce you to our panel, and they really are tip-top this time. Our first panelist I want to introduce to is Dr. Linda Yu. She'll be a very familiar face, a very familiar figure to many of you because she's often to be found on the television or on the radio, giving us the benefit of her wisdom. But her day job is she's a fellow in economics at St Edmund Hall, Oxford University. She's also an adjunct professor of economics at the London Business School. And of course, her ideas will be helping us today. We look forward to hearing them. Volta Vieiro has been with the stainless steel and nickel alloy multinational Valbruna Group for 31 years, now director and secretary for subsidiaries throughout the group. He's also been a client of Atradius for 28 of those 31 years. So very, very familiar with Atradius, and we're delighted to have him with us today. Bart-Jan Koopman is the director of EVO Venedex, the Dutch Association for Trade, Export, Import and Logistics. Now that represents 15,000 companies in the Netherlands. He advises SMEs and multinationals on their strategy and also advises the Dutch government on trade issues. And lastly, but not least, Eric Den Bugert joins me from Hong Kong, where he is based. Eric has been managing director of Atradius in Asia for 10 years, having been with the company since 1995. So as you can see, we've really got a fantastic panel. Linda, let's really start with basics. What is de-globalization? Is it happening? And will it redefine trade?
Thanks for the great question, Daisy. And it's lovely to be here to speak on, I think, one of the, perhaps, certainly to me, one of the biggest challenges in thinking about where the world economy is and where it might head, which is globalization has been with us our entire lifetimes. Many of us have traveled overseas. We do businesses across border. We study in different countries. So deglobalization, I think, is particularly worrying because what it picks up is a reversion of that, a reversal. Supply chain disruptions have been happening due to the pandemic. So we have also seen rivalry between the United States and China, and that has also led to additional cost in terms of supply chains. And I would also stress that the geopolitical tensions are not limited to the US and China. You also have seen it in Europe. You've also seen it elsewhere, including in Asia. So I think those are the factors that make people think, are we entering into a world where there's greater protectionism? And if so, should I be thinking about having, say, a resilient supply chain? Should I be thinking about having a national, local alternative? And I think it will redefine the way that we trade. How it's redefined, I think, is the answer to the, I'm going to say, $1 trillion question.
Yeah, I'm sure it's actually more than $1 trillion, isn't it, if we're talking about global trade. Linda, thank you so much. You really set it out there. And it's not all doom and gloom, but obviously there's a lot of imponderables. There are lots of things we just don't know yet. Volta, just bringing you in, are you seeing the deglobalization trends as a result of the pandemic on steel and nickel?
Well, the trend started, at least in our industry, before the pandemic. It started with the Trump presidency in the US. And as soon as Trump was elected, there were a lot of discussions about reshoring started, and for geopolitical reasons, as it was indicated before. So it was a pre-existing trend. Then the COVID gave it another connotation. So the COVID and the results and disruptions due to COVID gave this more of an operational urgency to have shorter and more, let's say, compact and resilient supply chains. And this is to reduce the risk of delays and disruptions. So in this respect, Valbruna has manufacturing both in Italy and in the US, but we made a strategic decision in September 2019 to buy a melt shop in Canada to feed our US operations, US manufacturing operation. And so we basically, with this move, we shortened considerably our North American supply chain. We have almost self-contained North American operations right now. And so this is allowing us to reduce our risks and be much closer to our customers.
And Volker, do you see that as a permanent change or permanent solution, or might that change again? I was interested that you were saying the trend was already there before the pandemic started.
Well, I believe it depends on, let's say, what companies value and what is important for them. We value a lot being close to our customers. So as a result of this, I believe that for a company like Valbruna and with our philosophy, this is going to be a permanent feature.
Yeah.
And of all the different, let's say, words that have been used, the one I like most is the nearshoring words, in the sense that unless a country is very big, like the US or China, but for the other countries, it's in general quite difficult to think of a self-contained supply chain within one country.
Yeah,
But,
and there's something of a negative connotation sometimes with offshoring, whereas
yes.
Nearshoring perhaps sounds less negative. I'm going to bring Bart in now. Bart, talking about de-globalisation and how it affects businesses.
I can very much relate to, because that is to a large extent also what is our experience here in the Netherlands from our customer base. Although, let's say, nearshoring, it depends a little bit if they do just adjust their supply chain, or if they really get production back from whatever, let's say, country like China back to Europe, or even back to the Netherlands. Getting back production, that is quite a big issue. I think it would be clear to say that from our experience, we're getting much more into a world of real trading blocks. And it's not so much that globalization has stopped, but we get more of an issue like, well, the China-US issue, but also the US-Europe issue is still there. Basically about a truce on maybe an issue like Boeing, Airbus, but it is also with steel and aluminium tariffs, they're still there, and they're not going away in the very near future. But we have to acknowledge that also the world trading system and the WTO is in a pretty bad shape, and we have quite a lot of problems to get protectionism out of that system. And I think that is what a lot of my companies at least do experience. Protectionism is increasing to a large extent, which would add to that the cost of transport. And that makes that some business would maybe get out of business because the cost of transport has gone too high.
Linda, comments on what Bart was saying?
Yeah, I agree with what Bart was saying. I think when you look at the trend of how much competition there is between countries. We are now in an era where the WTO, which, for the most part, polices that. It's a rules-based system. You're supposed to take your disputes there. It's supposed to allow countries not to use tariffs or even a phrase which is quite provocative, the weaponization of trade. In other words, using tariffs and trade restrictions and blocks on investment to resolve political differences. The WTO as a global body is supposed to prevent that, but that requires the World Trade Organization to be functioning effectively, and it has struggled. So, for instance, the consensus basis for setting rules for global trade requires 164 countries and blocs to agree. And I think I would probably just add one more thing about supply chain is there's quite a lot of cost in moving supply chains, and companies will be very wary of doing it dramatically. And I also just want to mention, you want to make supply chains resilient, but you also want to keep ahead of the technology. So another technology which has shortened supply chains is things like additive manufacturing. It's a very fancy word for 3D printing. So you just print the part. And so the airline industry, for instance, the majority of an airplane you go on, remember when we used to all fly, has a 3D printed part. In other words, instead of getting it even in a just-in-time supply chain, the technology is there just to print the part that you need, and then you stick it in. So that is another, I think, complication and why it's so hard to work out the net effect of greater technology and geopolitical tensions on what's going to happen to trade. But I suppose the only certainty is trade and supply chains will look different in the 21st century as a result.
Yeah, I think I find 3D printing so fascinating, and the cost of it has gone down so hugely over the last year. And as you said, it's being used everywhere. Eric, we've obviously been talking specifically about supply chains and de-globalisation, whether it's offshoring or nearshoring or whatever shoring you want to call it. But give us the perspective from Asia.
Okay, thank you very much, Daisy. Yeah, I think from our discussions with companies in Asia, we see that the same topics are keeping them busy. Where a few years ago, people were hoping that the US-China trade war would be a temporary issue, companies have now accepted that it will be more a permanent fact of life. Companies are looking for alternatives for sourcing and manufacturing in China for other reasons than cost. The shift to set up alternative supply chains, as was already mentioned by the others, has already been going on for a number of years, and we have seen that mainly in countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, for example. But having said that, I mean, a recent study by the EU Chamber of Commerce in China on business confidence painted a very positive picture of European companies in the country. So while some manufacturing could move, the huge domestic market and the enormous manufacturing capabilities are still very interesting, even for European companies. So on the one hand, there's a lot more political uncertainty about what these changes may bring. But on the other hand, I think companies in Asia also are still very excited about the high growth potential.
Linda, just coming back, what would your prediction be as to what you think are the number one or couple of factors that most people base their decisions on as far as supply chains?
Yeah, I think, what was it that Yogi Berra said? Predictions are difficult, particularly when they're about the future. But I think of the choices, certainly in terms of cost, there's several of these that refer to cost. And actually labor, we think of labor as being a cost issue. It's also an efficiency issue. So part of what drives reshoring is technology and greater efficiency and automation. So I think all of that will play a factor. What I find also really interesting is obviously we've discussed disruption. That is one thing. If you look at the G7 communique, which, by the way, if nobody's read it, I completely understand. But if you were to read it, there is a section where they agree that they will in the future stress test systematically important supply chains. So that is the conflation of economic issues, which is companies making efficient commercial decisions, with national security, intelligence, data concerns of these countries. And so that's a trend that I think that will continue. Sorry, Daisy.
When the G7 says they'll stress test, how does that differ? How does that differ from what we have at the moment, or what they do at the moment?
So I should also say supply chains at the moment are predominantly a commercial decision by companies. They decide where it makes sense, what is cost effective. And when there are shortages, then the tendency might be to think, oh, maybe I should keep it for my own country. So there's a lot of different factors there, but it's feeding into a sense that countries will think about supply chains feeding into strategically important industries as something that they need to make sure they will stress test in a way that you would examine if there was a closure of borders, would we still be able to deliver essential services? Now, the operationalizing of this is obviously challenging to say the least, but the direction of travel is consistent with countries now taking a more active stance within supply chains. I think we will see this continue.
Very interesting. Linda, you don't need to worry about what Yogi Bear said, because you got it pretty much spot on. I might get, I think just to get a quick response to that. Volta, I know you can't see the poll in front of you, but if I just repeat there for you, the number one factor was cost, second one, disruption to supply chain, third, credit risk, and then proximity, and then skills and labor. Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't surprise me, but I would say that the situation is different in different industries and for different companies. So in my opinion, there is not one correct answer. It depends on the type of industry and the type and philosophy of the company that makes one of these options the most appropriate, let's say.
And Eric, I just wonder from a trader's perspective, that credit risk has come in as the third most important factor. Is that where you would expect to see it?
That's a very good question, and that's why we have been racking up brains also for quite a while. I mean, logically, you would expect in a time of big disruptions, companies being closed, etc., that there will be quite a lot of insolvencies. Of course, governments have stepped in an enormous way that we haven't seen since probably 2008, and they probably stepped in earlier and with more force. So we expect that will have a huge that has had a huge impact. But even then, I think it's surprisingly actually how low the default levels have been for the last year and a half. But we expect it also to go back to normal again.
Well, I was going to say, will we go back to normal? Because, of course, what a lot of people, specifically here in the UK, are saying is that the furlough system, that the government aid that's been put in, might well just be postponing the inevitable, and that we're putting off the pain.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assumption. I mean, a lot of the grants have to be paid back at some stage, and companies need to be profitable and making money to actually to be able to do it. So I don't think governments can afford to write everything off. So we will see an uptick in the number of insolvencies going forward.
Linda, I want to move us on and just talk about Mode 5 services and where they fit into global trade flows. And can they facilitate, we've talked a lot already about technology, but trade-led technological progress?
So when I was describing earlier the smartphone, it's not just the components, it's also the design, the R&D. That's actually an example of what economists are calling Mode 5 services. It's the embedded service, because most things these days, not everything, but most things have quite a lot of value added from the R&D, from inputs, which are not just captured by the physical stuff. So when it is embodied in a physical good, it is subject to a tariff because you put a tariff on the sale of an iPhone. So having better governance around this could actually unleash a lot of global trade. And that's where the Mode 5 service push at the World Trade Organization by some countries, led by the European Union, is coming from.
Yeah, this really is a complicated issue, because so many people, when they talk about exporting, they just think about a product. They don't think about services. And Bart, I want to get your perspective on this, because obviously you represent so many different organizations, but trade-wise, just picking up on what Linda was saying there, between the difference between services and manufacturing, how does it look from where you sit?
Well, interesting enough, what you do see is a few things on the structural side again. If you just look to Europe in our internal market, we think about it's one internal market, but the regulation of the goods is a very different topic than the regulation of the services in that. And if you go beyond the internal market example, that is also the case in general, more in the world. So also regulating this service industry, so to speak, is still a difficult topic, and we are still, let's say, miles behind what we could do to stimulate both sides. And also, you had the example of 3D printing before. You can imagine that you sell the equipment, but also very much important is that you keep it up and going, the software, etc., etc. So that is a very, let's say, new element in the whole functioning of services, I would say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Linda, one for you that I'm going to go to this one. Yes, so this is something that we haven't really touched on, but it was in the poll, which is the sort of sustainability side of things. Can the planet survive ongoing globalization in terms of climate change? Is de-globalization what the planet needs?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, because that is something that will transform the way that we organize trade and production, because we all say it needs to serve the customer, and the customer wants to have trade and manufacturing and their products and services done in a sustainable way. And the challenge, I think, for everyone is that during this transition, which could be many decades, will there be more of a stress on buying local, looking for companies that do, because people are concerned about it, and that will push companies to try and change their behavior, and that may actually predate any real green transition, especially in the transport sector. And I would also say, we've been talking a lot about services and data, which we think of, it's called the intangible economy. The most obvious and talked about one is around, cryptocurrencies. If you were to mine some of the cryptocurrencies, it takes a lot of energy. Data centers, the amount of data centers that we're going to need to capture all this intangible economy means having massive data centers. Data centers emit a lot of energy and need a lot of energy. So even this intangible services-based data is going to have a massive impact on carbon. I think this push is another major factor in how we should see the 21st century economy and trading system evolve.
Yeah, very interesting. Walter, I have a question for you. Now that the pandemic has revealed the crucial interdependence between manufacturing industry and raw material suppliers, do you, Walter, think that suppliers can now press for better prices?
Maybe in the short term, but then things will tend to adjust in the longer term. I believe that the nearshoring concept will play a role here as well, because, for instance, the rare earths case was mentioned earlier, and of course there is a big concern by the US of China being a dominant supplier of rare earths. But there are a lot of rare earths that can be mined in Canada as well. And so it is in the best interest of the US and Canada to partner and develop this industry across border in the US and Canada. And so this will, let's say, in the longer term, allow an adjustment that will be beneficial for all the parties involved.
Yeah, thank you. Bart, do you think that many European producers really will move their operations from Asia, specifically China, back to Europe?
What I tried to say before, there's still a lot of the production of European manufacturers in China, for instance, is also for Asia or even for China itself, which is still a very fast growing market. So what we tend to see is that people and companies bring their production sometimes partially back to serve the trading blocks. So then you avoid the tariffs, then you avoid long of the supply chain lines. It's more resilience built in. And of course, the cost is a little bit higher because if you duplicate some of the production, that is, you cannot do that for every sector, of course, because of all the policies also getting in place and the sustainability issue mentioned. If you have, in the very near future, for instance, a carbon border adjustment tax from the European Commission, well, you might indeed want to take much more production here in Europe and you feel more protected. But if that's not coming through, why would you change your production? So I think there's a new balance to find.
Thank you. Linda, I guess this is another very big question, very practical question. When do you think the container issue will come to an end?
So shipping is not really my area, but I think I just want to pick up a point that Bart mentioned about the carbon adjustment mechanism. So if the European Union were to put this forward in a kind of WTO compliant way in the next 2 years, that has a significant potential impact on supply chains, because any production which doesn't meet the same environmental standards in terms of emissions as a European producer within the EU, then they will be subject to an additional tariff to equalize the impact of carbon. So a carbon tax is what most economists think we will eventually head to in order to address climate change. And this will not be the only initiative around what's known as carbon leakage.
Now, I'm very aware that we've only got a few minutes left, and I'm thrilled, but slightly concerned that there's been a flurry of questions that are coming in. So apologies in advance if I don't get to all of them. But Linda, what's the connection between de-globalisation and inflation?
Inflation at the moment is driven by a release of pent-up demand. So you see this pattern pretty clearly when people are able to leave their homes and to travel. You begin to see, price pressures, and that's what inflation is, which is a price increase. Traditionally, globalization has brought down prices because manufacturing is cheaper in emerging economies. And for years, this was known as the China price. But up until about a few years ago, wages in China started to rise. And that was already eliminating the China price, and production in China moved to other parts of Asia. I think going ahead, it's going to be a more complicated relationship. There won't be a massive sort of major economic force. There'll be other things like growing population, like supply chain distortions. And if we do see another commodity boom, that will be because we're moving into a new generation of technology and production. And we may well see that with a green transition overlay on that.
As I said, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to launch our last simple question, but not such a simple answer, I would guess. So the simple question is, do you believe de-globalisation will stick? And I might just put that question to our panel for some final thoughts. Eric, de-globalisation, is it here for good?
Yes.
Well, that is a short answer. Walter, is it here for good? I think it is for your business.
Well, it is definitely a strong trend, but things are likely to change in the future. So we should never say never. So we just need to be resilient and adapt to the changes that the future has on hold for us.
Yeah. And Bart?
I think we're in a transition period with a lot of big challenges, from climate to all kind of other things. And I think this whole rebalancing in this transition period comes with quite a few also geopolitical issues. And I do hope that this rebalancing means that we're getting and still keeping up the good things about globalization, and that some of the stuff will maybe then in a deglobalized way might be okay. But if it ends up all in sanctions with Russia, or we have another Brexit or what have you, I don't think that will be a proper outcome of deglobalization.
Mm. And Linda, your thoughts, and specifically, if it is here to stay, we've talked about how it will impact inflation, but how will it impact the general global economic recovery from the pandemic?
And it will hamper it to the extent that you're adding uncertainty to uncertainty. But I think it's inevitable, because this trend, as we've discussed, has actually been there for some time. I think deglobalization is likely to stick, at least this kind of trend, unless we can make trade not just free, but fair. And that picks up the domestic unhappiness with the impact of trade, which you see in lots of countries. So having free and fair trade means having global rules, as we've discussed, but also helping people adjust to the impact of changing trade and technology. And that's a very big issue for lots of countries. But unfortunately, it takes time.
Linda, you were emphasising fairness there. And what are you specifically thinking at the moment is unfair or needs to be made fairer?
So we've known for 200 years that trade creates losers. So there will be sectors which a country no longer specializes in. So employment there gets squeezed. And how we help those losers from trade is something we should have addressed better for a long time, but we haven't. And so to make trade fairer requires getting domestic buy-in by helping workers and companies adjust. So this has happened through history. If you think about the creation of the welfare state, and remember the 50s and 60s were known as the golden age of economic growth.
Well,
so it is possible to be
draw
fair.
this golden discussion to a close. On that note, with a very big thank you to my panel, I'm going to hand back to Andreas.
Thanks, Daisy. Well, that was a very fascinating discussion, and I'm particularly intrigued by the combination of science and business practice. So thanks for participating in this discussion to all our panelists, and also thanking for you, to you, our guests, for joining us and for participating in the polls. I believe the potentially biggest takeaway from today's discussion was that we are experiencing a period of change. It was my pleasure to bring this event to you today and also the previous times. Thanks again for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed these small moments where a digital screen brought us all together during these challenging times for businesses and for the way we live. And we hope they give you food for thought and insight into trade dynamics and trends, but we also hope to see you soon again in person as well. So that's it from us for now. Stay safe, stay well. Thank you and goodbye.